Welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Unseen Histories. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. Today we're off to the mid-15th century to see one of the great technological inventions at the moment of its creation. In October 1454, the diplomat Ennio Silvio Piccolomini, later to become Pope Pius II, arrived at the great Frankfurt Fair. The annual event attracted people from right across Europe. Merchants carried wool from over the sea in England. There was Italian wine and Bohemian glass, and delights from the distant east like nutmeg, cloves and cinnamon. The item that caught Piccolomini's attention, though, was none of these. On display for the very first time was a curious collection of papers. These papers were covered by a script that was at once beautiful and defined and yet perfectly regular in two neat columns. Within days, Piccolomini was writing back to his friends in Rome of his miraculous discovery. Today we know that he'd got the very first glimpse of one of Johannes Gutenberg's magnificent Bibles. Today's guest is going to guide us through this whole enchanting historical story. Susan Denham-Wade is the author of a sweeping new book called A History of Seeing in 11 Inventions. In it she traces the contrasting ways that humans have interpreted the world around them. Stephen Fry has called the book a remarkable achievement. Susan joined me just the other day for a travel back through time. Susan Denham-Wade, it's a real pleasure to be talking to you today. How are you?
I'm very well, Peter. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I'm loving it.
Good. Well, as I was saying to you just before we started recording, we've got a wonderful historical story to talk about today. But as ever, I want to just start with the book that kind of takes us to the story. And in your case, it's your first book. And I was thinking, well, at first book, you should try something very modest and easy and simple, maybe concentrate on a little set of primary source material. But what you've actually done is extraordinarily ambitious. You've set out to write the history of seeing and perception. Can you tell us a little bit about this book that's brought us here today?
Yes, well, it was inspired by the internet meme that came out, I think it was 2015, of the dress, which was this image of a dress that some people saw as black and blue and other people saw as white and gold. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah.
And it was this phenomenon that people would be looking at their screen together and one person would see it one way and one person would see it the other way. And that got me thinking about how subjective seeing is. And it made me wonder about whether if you and I could be standing looking at the same screen in the same time and place, how did someone who lived hundreds of years ago see the world? Did they see differently? And I have to say, I started with a completely blank slate. I had no idea, so the first thing I started looking into was how does seeing actually work? And then I looked into the evolution of eyes because I thought, well, maybe our eyes have evolved in the sort of million years that humans have existed. But actually I found that eyes were one of the very first things to evolve in the entire animal kingdom. And eyes have existed for something like 500 million years. And in fact, eyes very similar to our own have existed for about 300 million years and haven't really changed that much since. So it just got me really excited about the whole process of vision and seeing, and then trying to find a way to investigate how people did see their world, because obviously, it's a slightly tricky thing. You can't ask someone. Yeah. I mean, obviously art is a very important source. So anyway, but in the end, what I decided to do was think about, well, when might have been the points in history when seeing underwent some sort of change through a technology or a skill or something. And that led me to the structure of the book, the 11 inventions that ended up being the chapters in the book.
So it's a nice combination, really, of science and history, but there's this important idea that I suppose you're putting to us, which is goes against what I suppose would be received knowledge, which is that seeing is thought of as an objective experience, but obviously, as in the case of the dress showed, it's not always like that. Is that right? I mean, how objective is sight? Is that too big a question? Can you give me an answer to that?
Well, it is a big question, but it's not really objective at all. It actually, our brain and the thought parts of our brain that, including our memories and culture and our mood, are all involved in seeing right from the outset of the process of perceiving. So when we look around at something, our central focal point is actually very small. It's right in the middle of our retina. And so, if you look at a book at arm's length, you can really only see in clear focus one or two words. And so when we're looking at something, when we think that we're looking at the whole world around us, we're actually really only looking at very specific little sections of it, and we're piecing together a picture of what we're seeing. And how our brain decides the way that we look around the scene in front of us, even if our eyes are apparently, we think we're looking straight ahead, or we think we're looking at the whole picture, our brain is actually directing us around that scene in different ways. And you and I might look at a scene quite differently if we come from a different background, or we've got different things going on in our minds that day. And there's been various research that has shown that cultural differences between, for example, people from a Western background and people from an Eastern background. One experiment showed people a scene with a central figure and a background. So say, an aeroplane and a jungle behind it, or a tiger and some mountain scenes. The people from the Western background focused much more on the central figure, whereas people from an Eastern background tended to look at the central figure, then look at the background around them, a lot more than the Western people. And the researchers concluded that this is because Western culture is much more individualistic, whereas Eastern culture tends to take account much more of the overall context. And this actually manifests itself in how we visually record a scene in our own brains. So it's not really subjective at all, even though the light rays coming in through your pupil, focusing on the retina, is an objective process. Everything that underpins that is directed by your brain.
Well, this is really fascinating. I can't let you get away without giving us some kind of explanation what was going on then in that strange episode that you mentioned right at the beginning with the dress. This is 2015, I think. And
yes.
Just to give a bit of a potted history, I think this is the moment when someone was out testing a wedding outfit, and they tried on a dress, and some people thought it looked one way, some people thought it looked another. Of course, it ended up on Twitter as a kind of global debate. Why were we seeing different things at that time? Was there ever any kind of scientific explanation to what went on then?
There was actually a huge flurry of scientific investigation into what happened. And it turned out that what was going on there was that image, the image of the dress, which just didn't show much of the person's head or legs. It's just the torso of this dress. And it had a perfect absence of information to make it ambiguous to people's brains. So when we look at something, we make assumptions unconsciously about whether we're looking at something in artificial light or in daylight. Artificial light is much warmer and more yellow, and daylight is much more blue. And we compensate in our perception of colour for what we understand. So that's why when you look at an object that's, I'm just looking at a yellow notebook, and part of it is in shade, but I know, I believe that the whole book is the same colour yellow, because I'm just compensating for the shade, because I know from experience that, unconsciously, it's all one colour. So when people looked at this image of the dress, apparently some people unconsciously assumed that the photo was taken in daylight, and they would have filtered out unconsciously filtered out the blue lights of the dress, the blue aspects of the image, leaving it as white and gold. Whereas other people seem to have unconsciously assumed it was taken in artificial light, therefore filtered out the yellower shades of light, leaving the dress perceived as blue and black. And even more interesting, there seemed to be a correlation between people's lifestyles and the assumptions, the unconscious assumptions that their brains were making. So these researchers asked people, various questions about what time of day they find themselves most productive, or what time they like to get up in the morning, go to bed. And it turned out that the night owls tended to assume that the photographs was taken in a artificial light, so they would tend to see the blue and black, whereas the early birds filtered out the blue lights and tended to see it as white and gold. So there was an actual substantial correlation between lifestyle and how people saw the dress.
It really is interesting, because it seems just in that moment there was a confluence of factors that revealed something that obviously goes on all the time, as you explained there, but we're blissfully unaware of. And it makes you wonder how many like kind of subtle differences my world might have to yours or to another person. And it's, as you say, it's very difficult to kind of get to these things, because we assume, I suppose, that we're seeing the same thing. Of course, we're not. So there we go. That's one thing.
And that's really the stock in trade of magicians, and is to play around with these unconscious assumptions that we all make when we're looking at things, to either misdirect our attention or to just play with those assumptions so that we perceive what they want us to perceive.
And I suppose, as you describe, like the contextual kind of factors which are changing the picture just then, which might be whether you're an early bird or you're kind of a bit of a night owl or whatever. This plays into the idea of history, because history is basically changing context, isn't it? We are in many ways very similar biologically to maybe the Romans or the Greeks or people much further back than that, but we live in a completely different context. So this obviously manifests itself today in debates about how we're not using our bodies in the right way. We're not supposed to sit down for long periods of time, because we're supposed to be walking around and things. And I suppose when you think about this idea of seeing, it's interesting to think about that changing culture and changing context, which will then inform the different types of seeing. So you said earlier that you have looked at 11 moments, was it, in time? Could you give us just a few of these? I know we're going to talk about one of them in particular, but just give us a flavour of a few that you think might have shaped the way that we perceive the world around us.
Well, the earliest one is mankind's management of fire and the discovery of how to use fire constructively, because that gave us the ability to be safe from other animals, but in particular to see in the dark, and that also ended up separating us from other animals. It promoted us up the food chain. It gave us cooking, which allowed our brains to develop because it was easier to digest food. So there's a whole lot of exciting things that happened around the discovery of fire. And then we move on to art, the first cave art that has been going around 55,000 years ago. And I explored the discovery of the Chauvet caves in France, which are these incredibly beautiful pictures on the walls of a cave, deep beyond where any natural light would have reached them, executed with real mastery of the craft of image making, and all must have been done from memory, because they're far beyond the subjects of the pictures, which were typically animals, very rarely images of people. And anyway, then we move on through mirrors. The introduction of mirrors about 8,000 years ago coincided amazingly with a shift in the consciousness of the community where they were found, from being a very egalitarian society to becoming more individualistic. This is identified by the archaeologists who've worked on this particular community in what's now Turkey for a dozen years. So mirrors, an amazing tool to see ourselves. We weren't built to see ourselves. So what happens when we do? What changes in our brain? And as you probably know, they're a much beloved and have been since Roman times beloved tool for interrogating our psychology and philosophy, and our understanding of ourselves, and how that makes both our personality but also our understanding of the world around us. So we're going to mirrors. So we're still very much in the ancient world here. Writing developed in Mesopotamia and Egypt, then eventually became the alphabet in Greece. Then shift forward quite a long time to discuss the invention of spectacles. Then we talk about the printing press, the telescope, industrialized light, photography, moving images. And then the last couple of chapters are all about the smartphone and what that's doing to society, and how that is channeling our daily experience to a degree that I question through our eyes, because we're increasingly doing, like you said about not moving around and so on, we are increasingly able to do most of our daily tasks just through the screen, which means we're not interacting with other people, we're not moving around, we're not going outside and smelling and hearing the sounds of nature. So I raised some questions about how good that is for us.
Well, as I said to you before, it's as a first book, this is no mean feat. I've read it. It's a wonderful tour through a lot of human history. Today, of course, we're just going to delve in to one particular year, and it's now the time for me to ask you the question that we ask of everyone who comes on, which is Susan Denham Wade. If you could travel back to one calendar year in the past, which one would you choose?
I've chosen the year 1454.
Okay, very, very good choice. And it's kind of adjacent to a choice we had before, which is 1453, which you might want to allude to in a moment, because I'm going to ask you what the world was like and what is the significance of that year to you? What attracts you to that time?
I'm attracted to what was going on in a particular town in Germany for reasons that we'll probably go into more detail in a minute. But it is a time of real, sort of feels pregnant with change in a way, that this period. It's really the beginning of the age of discovery. We're 40 years before Columbus's great journey, but it's all stirring. So there's a feeling of anticipation in the air. Probably not for everyday people, but certainly when you're reading about the history of that period, you'd think, gosh, this is a time when things are really happening.
Let's look at your history. Where would you like to go to if I'm giving you this opportunity to travel through 3 scenes? Where would you like to go to first?
Well, I'm going to Mainz, which I think is probably incorrectly pronounced, but I'm just going to stick with that, and apologies to any native German speakers, which is a town that sits on the Rhine River, which is the sort of super highway of the time. It's a really busy river transporting people up and down, and goods and cargo. So it would have been full of boats using sails and oars to move up and down the river. And Mainz sits on the junction of the Rhine and the Main River, which leads east towards Frankfurt.
It's we were talking about Albrecht Dürer a few episodes back, and he was this great figure of the Northern Renaissance. He came out of Germany, I don't know, a few decades later on, towards the end of the 15th century. And I suppose it was kind of interesting to me listening to Philip Hoare, who was describing his life and thinking about a different centre of Renaissance activity, because we're so used to thinking of Florence and Italy being, the kind of the place where everything was going on. But this, I'm going to pronounce it in the same way as you, so double apologies to anybody else. It's Mainz. It seems to be a real centre, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a very important city within the Holy Roman Empire, because the Archbishop of Mainz has a primary role, and I can't go into too much detail about it, not because it's secret, but because I don't know. But he has a primary role in the election of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So
It's politically significant, yeah.
within church politics of the time. But in other ways, it's very much just a typical medieval city. It's surrounded by a wall that has towers and gates to get into. And within the city, it's a very crowded, noisy, really smelly place, full of animals and people moving around all the time. If one were to walk through the city, you'd come upon the different quarters of the different trades plying their trades, and merchants, different sorts of merchants selling their wares, all within displaying the costume of their particular guild. So the guilds were a real feature of this period of medieval life, which was each profession or trade or skill or craft would be a member, compulsorily be a member of a guild. They would not be permitted to do the said activity if they weren't part of the guild. And these guilds were very tight societies and very secretive. They would pass on the secrets to apprentices over a period of many years. And this is all because it's still a very oral society. Not much is written down outside the church and the universities that are starting to spring up. And so quite often people used all sorts of interesting ways to remember complicated things. So, for example, say the process of the alchemy that would create various metal alloys. So they might use a rhyme or a ritual process to remember the sequence of events and activities that need to take place to do that. And this is really common. And I mean, we tend to think about it in terms of fairy tales. So if you think about the 7 dwarves going hi ho, it's off to work we go. That's a fun little thing in a movie. But in fact, that sort of thing was probably quite common in terms of people going about their daily activities.
Well, there's lots of reasons to pick this as a place, and the colour of the town, the animation of the people within it, the culture that's there. But it's all kind of typically medieval, as you say. So you'd kind of get a glimpse of society as it probably had been for maybe a few hundred years with a few changes, I suppose. But there is something particular about here that you want to kind of go and have a look at, isn't there?
Yeah, so walking through the town, you come upon the huge cathedral of St. Martin, which is where the Archbishop is based, this important Archbishop that we've discussed already. And on this particular day, I don't know the actual date, but a middle-aged man is walking into the cathedral and down some cloisters and corridors and into an office, and he's carrying a large bundle wrapped in cloth. And if we were to open the bundle, we'd see that it contains 200 or so leaflets, certificates, and these are indulgences. These are certificates of indulgence, allowing the person who buys them to get out of jail free, essentially, for sins. It doesn't actually forgive their sins, but it means they don't have to do the penance that they might otherwise have to do. And these indulgences are a massive money spinner for the church around this time. They're sold by their thousands to raise money for building projects or to wage wars. Probably at this time they were being sold to wage a war against the Turks, going back to the little problem in the east that had happened a year earlier. But if you looked closely at these indulgences, you'd notice something really unusual about them, because normally at this time, anything that was written, whether it's a letter, a contract, a certificate like these indulgences, or a whole book, would always be written by hand. That was the only way that that written material could be replicated. And so there's a whole industry of scribes creating written material for the church and copying manuscript books, which is a whole other story that one could discuss for ages. But if you look closely at this particular set of indulgences being delivered in Mainz into the cathedral there, you'd notice that they're all identical. And that's really strange, because no scribe could replicate a page of writing identically. But these indulgences are identical. And that's because the man delivering them is Johann Gutenberg. And he has produced these indulgences in his revolutionary printing press.
Well, I think we know where we're going to go in a minute, but I've got a few questions first. I suppose, could I ask you a little bit more about indulgences? Because immediately it's one of those words which triggers off associations with Luther and the Reformation. Are they by this point of the mid-15th century everywhere, or are they still kind of like a specialist thing which are pumped out once in a while when money's needed? Do you know?
I actually don't fully know the answer to that question. I know that they need to be, each sort of set of indulgences, there's a particular missive sent from either the Pope or one of the senior members of the church that gives granting permission to issue a set of indulgences. And that's typically when they have a need for a particular amount of money. And I know that there are different sorts of indulgences for different sorts of sins. There's a plenary indulgence, which is a sort of all-encompassing, but there are also indulgences for particular groups of people, particularly for clergy. There are some that were just specifically aimed at clergy. I don't know. I know they were being pumped out in their hundreds and thousands, and you can imagine that within Mainz for the archbishop there, that if this Gutenberg fellow could produce them quickly and in quantity, that was a huge boon for them, because then they can get them sold and raise money quicker than ever, because it would take a scribe about a day to produce one indulgence. So imagine, if this man can, within a week deliver hundreds of them.
He would very quickly become a very useful figure, I imagine. Do any of these, this is the exciting question, do any of these little scraps of indulgence, as I imagine they would be today, do they exist? Can you see them? How do we know about them?
You can look online. There are scraps of them, but they're only scraps. They've been much scrutinised as part of the whole, forensic analysis of Gutenberg and of the printing press in this period of time, with intense analysis of the particular typeface that's used in this one or that one. But they are quite substantial items. But as I say, they look like a certificate. The priest would fill in your name and sign it at the bottom and probably give it a seal, and that's your indulgence then paid for.
Yeah, I suppose he's doing what any inventor would do today in a way. He's got his new product and he's taking it along for inspection to the people who have the cash, and the people who have the cash and would become the best patrons, of course, are the church. So that's obviously what he's doing in the cathedral at this point. Let's
he's actually doing two things. I think he's doing some sort of practice run of the printing press, just perfecting the technology, and he's also cash flowing his bigger and more ambitious project.
Let's go to your second scene, because I think we're going to learn a bit more about this individual in question. Where would you like to go to next, please?
So we're still in Mainz, and it's now the summer of 1454, and we're in a workshop. We're in a workshop that is a printing workshop, but nobody knows it's a printing workshop because it's absolutely top secret what's going on in there. This is Gutenberg's business. And he has set up in here, he actually has two workshops near one another. And he has set up 6 printing presses, and they are engaged. Some of them are working on the everyday jobbing work, such as the indulgences. But the majority are working on this incredibly ambitious project that Gutenberg has to print 180 copies of a full Bible, making them as perfect as humanly possible.
Six presses. So this is all kind of quite advanced in a way. But this is the dream, isn't it? If you're going to make anything, make a Bible. And if you're going to make a Bible, make a beautiful Bible. And this, I suppose, is the ambition that you alluded to just a moment ago when you said the kind of the greater project. It's a dream, isn't it, to create the world's most beautiful Bible in a regular form?
Yeah, this is the dream of of Gutenberg. It's both. I think it's both an idealistic dream in a way, because it offers a definitive version of the book that will bring together Catholicism, because part of all the anxiety about what's going on in the East is the lack of resolution between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And so this is sort of part of a political movement within the Church to try and reunite the two sides. But also, and I think probably primarily, it's a business venture. I think he is an entrepreneur as I picture him. Not that much is known about him as a person. We know stuff about his background. His father was a patrician, part of the patrician class of Mainz. His mother was from a lower class. He was the second son, so he had to find a way to make his own money. And I think, and he'd been in some interesting business ventures earlier in his life, but I think arguably these were all leading up to this grand project of which the Bible was going to be the calling card of creating a printing press using movable type.
I know. There's in kind of preparation for this, I was looking up a bit about Gutenberg's biography. As you say, he's a very elusive character. We don't know very much, but he seems to be about 60 years old by this point, which is pretty old, really, for the time. But the other thing which I really liked is that they do know from looking through the archive that he was sued for defamation, which I thought was a wonderful anecdote for someone who's inventing printing, as kind of the the kind of pioneer of that as well. But yeah, I mean, he was a man who was very, very good with his hands. He was a practiced kind of, I don't know how you describe him that, but he would be a kind of product of the kind of person you'd find in Mainz, wouldn't he?
Yes, I think so, because this the sort of the politics within the city itself was very much and quite often at loggerheads between the patrician class, which is sort of the old money gentry, and the guildsmen, who are the members of this rising artisan and merchant class, who are, as I described, all part of these secretive groups, but some of those were making reasonable money, and it's the very, very early days of capitalism too. So you're starting to see people investing in businesses as a with a view to future profits, which is quite a new thing. Most of life up till now has been preoccupied by investing in life after death, but we're now starting to see, and Gutenberg indeed has investors who lent him money on the prospect of the returns later from his Bible project initially.
And there was another technological problem, another technological point I wanted to pick up with you, which is about movable type and woodblock printing. Now, woodblock printing had been around for a little bit of time, hadn't it, before this?
Yes.
Which is essentially when you just carve the kind of the typescript you want into a block of wood, as described. But that's completely impractical for a massive project like the Bible, of course, because you'd have to have a different woodblock for each page, and it would just go on and on and on. Can you just talk a little bit about movable type and what the difference is there?
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, as you say, I mean, so just to put into context, the size of the project he was undertaking, each Bible was 1,200 pages, and each page was 2 columns, quite dense text, each 42 lines long. So you can imagine, as you say, the task to carve all that out of woodblock is just not even conceivable. So the technology of the movable type, the genius of it was that each letter and symbol was carved just once to make a master, and that was called a punch. And he would actually have multiple versions of different letters in order to make the typesetting as attractive as possible. But I'll talk about that in a second. But the punch was then would be punched, and this was a long-standing technology that had been used in coin making and other sort of crafts for many, many years. The punch would make an indentation into some sort of mould. No one knows exactly how the mould worked, but this was called a matrix. Then using a mould, a metal alloy, which in this case was tin, lead and aluminy, was poured into the mould, and the result would be a little stick. These are the individual types, which was a little metal stick with a moulded letter that was in mirror image at the end of it. And that was the type. And the genius of it was that using this technique, you could make as many of an individual letter as you needed to do your typesetting for your page. So imagine on a single page, you might need 100 letter E's, for example. You could make 100 of these, or you could make as many as you wanted to, from this one punch and matrix, and they're all identical to one another. Then how that translates into a printed page is all the different types organised on these big tables, a bit like an architect's drawing table, that is divided into lots of little boxes, and all the capital letters are arranged in the uppercase, and all the small letters are arranged in the lowercase, and that's where those words come from. And then a compositor uses a little stick, a bit like a Scrabble stick, a Scrabble rack, and picks out the letters one by one that makes up the line of text that they're working on. And as I say, it's all in mirror image, so they have to be quite careful and concentrate. And then each line goes from the compositing stick into a case that's called a form. And so that's built up then line by line by line, down the 42 lines, then the next column down the 42 lines. And in the case of the Gutenberg Bible, it's quite an amazing feat of craft that the columns are almost perfectly justified, both left and right, in both columns. Then little bits of wood are inserted into it just to hold everything really tightly in place. So you've got this little wooden tray that now has the two columns of metal types arranged to form the words, and then stuffed with other little bits to hold everything tightly in place.
Yeah, I mean, genius indeed, because the number of different skills that you have to do something like that is, I don't know, it's just remarkable. So you have to have the kind of aesthetic ability to kind of create the shapes for the font in the first place, and you have to have the technical ability. You have to have access to the materials, which I suppose takes us back to Mainz. You have to have the ideas of, the experience of working with metals. There was somewhere where I read that that Gutenberg had previously worked on these things called pilgrim's mirrors. I don't know if you've heard about these, but these are the ideas.
Oh, I love this. Yeah,
it's a wonderful fact. So when they had a particular relic, you could hold the mirror up and it would kind of suck up the power of the kind of sacred object. Is that right? Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I love that detail because, I have a chapter in the book about mirrors, and also another chapter in the book about the medieval relationship between sight and faith.
I suppose what I was thinking about is this concentration of talent in the person of Gutenberg, of course, who we're looking at. And then he's enabled by this kind of northern Renaissance city that he's living in to have access to the materials to make it all work. But I just know from my own work, I've been writing about Benjamin Franklin for the last couple of years, and this, what you described a minute ago, is pretty much exactly the same technology that was at work in, say, the mid-18th century. This movable type was so good. It was so different. I mean, if you're going from the scriptorium and people writing, the scribes writing out everything in hand, to something like this in a short space of time, it really is astonishing. It's an astonishing moment in the historical story. And it's quite nice to think that it was done in top secrecy. Do we know anything about that, like, veil of secrecy that he had over the project from the historical record?
Not a lot. I mean, we know that he referred to it as the work of books. So that's when he and his business partner came to a sticky end a couple of years after this. The court documents refer to this work of books. And we know that the initial Bibles were designed to replicate handwriting, manuscript style handwriting, as closely as possible. So it was later iterations of printed books start to experiment with different sorts of typeface. But this was really, I really genuinely don't know whether he realised what a revolutionary idea this was and how much it was going to eventually change the world. I really wonder whether he was, obviously, as you say, he's brought together these existing technologies, the punch and matrix moulding thing. His father was associated with the Mainz mint, so he would have been familiar with the process of coin making, and that's really the origin of the metal type casting. And he's also Mainz is in the middle of the wine growing area, so the screw mechanism on the press is very similar, or it's the same as had been used for many years in wine presses.
That's fascinating.
So he's just done that sort of classic innovative, innovation thing of bringing together existing technologies and combining them in a new way to create something that completely revolutionary.
It really is fascinating. And I suppose the idea that we know a bit, but we don't know much, makes the interior of his press room and just the place to be, because you'd be able to see all of this at work. Do you know, like, again, this is from the historical evidence we have, did he work alone, or if he had 6 presses, it kind of suggests that he must have had a bit of a team of workers. And you alluded to his business partner and the sticky end. Do you want to say anything about that broader kind of Gutenberg operation for a moment?
Yes, well, he will have had, so each press would have 2 men working on it, one preparing the paper and the other inking the type. So when the case of type, all made up into its page, is put onto the bed of the press, the inker takes the inking ball, which is a leather ball stuffed with horsehair or wool on the end of a stick. It looks a little bit like a plunger, if anyone still knows what a plunger is, except it's a round ball at the end, and then that's rubbed into some ink that's prepared on a surface. One of the other innovations of the Gutenberg press was the ink that he developed, which was an oil-based ink, which was different from what had been used for handwriting. And they would rub this ball around in the ink and then dab it over the type to create a nice even layer of ink. And then the paper, which the other worker had been attaching to a little thing called a timpan, which was a frame that was then covered with a frisket, which looks like a mount on a picture frame, that held the paper perfectly flat. And that whole thing was hinged onto the press and would be folded over so that it laid down exactly flat and evenly across the type. And then that whole case would be slid under the main frame of the press, the vertical frame of the press. The lever would be pulled that turned the screw and pushed the plate down onto that page, making the impression of push the paper down onto the inked types. The plate would be lifted, the case would be slid out from underneath, and the timpan lifted, and the page peeled off. And that's a printed page.
Hello, Peter here. Today's episode is supported by the History Press, the United Kingdom's largest dedicated history publisher. As many of you will already know, the History Press has been publishing fascinating books like Susan Denham Wade's for many years, and in no way are they confined to the 15th century world we're talking about today. In fact, their books span all eras of the past, and current highlights include Samuel Pepys and the Strange Wrecking of the Gloucester by the naval historian Nigel Pickford, the German street style, which looks into the cultural impact of one of London's famous tailoring streets, and for those of you who just love the Tudors, and let's face it, who doesn't, there's an enticing new work called Wood, Smoke and Sage, The Five Senses, 1485 to 1603, How the Tudors Experienced the World. Check out any, or indeed all of these, at the History Press's website, which is www.thehistorypress.co.uk. And what they held up would be, well, it's the kind of one thing that we do have, and let's go to it now, because I think we're going to encounter the object that was in production inside the press room in your third scene. So where is your third scene? Let's see.
So the third scene, we're now going up the main river to Frankfurt. And Frankfurt at this time is the site of an annual trade fair. And this is a huge fair. Tens of thousands of people would come from all over Europe to the trade fair. And there was a special decree issued some years earlier for towns where these fairs were taking place, warning against interfering with anybody coming to or from these fairs. So presumably, warning off any bandits, that they would be potential bandits of people obviously bringing their wares and bringing their money and buying things and taking them home again. So it was a big undertaking in the main city hall known as the Roma, which again I'm probably really mispronouncing, where people would come from all over and trade in the goods of the goods of the day. So it would be wool cloth, silk, precious metals, spices, glass from Venice, and manuscripts. It was a place where manuscripts were traded. And in this year, 1554, there is an Italian Cardinal Piccolomini, who is there in Frankfurt at the time of the fair. He's not there for the purposes of the fair. He's there to try and persuade some German princes to raise an army to go and fight the Turks. So again, this issue of what's happened over in Constantinople is woven into all sort of stages of the story. But while he's there, he sees these quinternions. So a quinternion is the name for the sections of a book it's one way of making sections of a book. If you think of an old-fashioned hardback book that has the little sort of loops of pages. So a quinternion is 5 sheets of paper laid on top of each other and folded together, giving eventually 20 printed pages. So each sheet contains 4 printed pages, and then when they're assembled into this quinternion, that creates a little booklet, a part of a book that's 20 pages. So this is what he sees while he's in Frankfurt, Piccolomini. And he writes later to a colleague of how wonderful this material is. And he also actually mentions the marvellous man who was selling them. And we don't know whether that was Gutenberg or his business partner Fust. It may well have been his partner, because probably at this stage Gutenberg is still busily trying to complete this work, supervising this printing as it's going on.
One of the things that I think is worth stressing, because if we went from the kind of incredibly localized situation of Mainz before, Frankfurt's not far away. It's maybe not much bigger. But the thing about the fair, as I can understand it, is it was quite an international affair. People would travel there from the Baltic countries, from maybe further towards France, from Italy. You obviously have your this cardinal who's come from Italy. So among all of that, this kind of really exciting novelty, and what I suppose these quinternions just sitting there on a table to be discovered. Just describe how beautiful these are as a kind of taste of what was coming out of Gutenberg's press rooms.
Yeah, well, at the time that they came out, and probably what Piccolomini would have seen, they would probably not have been decorated. They were designed to be decorated after the printing. That wasn't part of the printing, but the printing was just the text. But just that text is and you can see it. There's a beautifully digitized copy that you can see through the British Library website, and you can really zoom in and really get quite intimate with it. But the text it's perfect. It's, as I said earlier, it's perfectly aligned, justified left and right, in a way that must have been incredibly difficult to do. The letters are all carved perfectly. Clearly, Gutenberg was an utter perfectionist, and presumably discarded any impressions that weren't up to scratch. And the paper that he used was Italian paper. There was a paper works in Mainz at the time, but he didn't feel that was of a sufficient quality, so he imported paper from Italy for his Bibles. And then a subset of them were printed onto vellum, which is a calf skin that was much more expensive and difficult to get hold of in sufficient quantities. So magical in a way, in their, as I said, the perfection. And although it's quite difficult for our Western eyes to read the Gothic script, if you sort of, it's a bit like listening to Shakespeare or something. If you kind of train your eye for a little while, it's incredibly clear. And it's this, and I'm talking about 500 years after the fact. So they really are beautiful items. And then what happened, and the ones that we see now, were decorated and rubricated. That's the name for. Quite often capital letters were written in red ink, decorated with margin, beautiful drawings and designs. Although, having said that, this illumination of manuscripts was pretty much destroyed by the printing press for reasons that we can talk about. But the actual Gutenberg, the copies that still exist, are mostly beautifully decorated and objects of works of art, really.
The place to be, I think, is kind of loitering near whatever exhibition table he had at the moment that Piccolomini goes and walks by, because in our kind of big kind of top 10 moments of the Renaissance, that has to be up there. The Renaissance has been going on for a long time. There's been this kind of groundswell of interest in learning in the past, and I suppose anyone who's in a position of kind of power and status like him might instantly grasp that if you can produce a book as quickly as Gutenberg can, once all the the kind of galleys and type is arranged, what kind of change in knowledge might you have? I suppose that's one just for us to ponder. But can you tell us a little bit about how quickly after 1454 this kind of caught on as a new technology that people could actually access rather than just being in the testing phase? So quite quickly the run of Bibles was a huge hit. It sold out. As I said, Gutenberg and his partner Fust fell out for reasons that aren't entirely clear, but Fust ended up taking over the business with his son-in-law, or soon-to-be son-in-law, who had actually been Gutenberg's apprentice. It's a guy called Peter Schoeffer. And together Fust and Schoeffer set up the first printing business in Europe. And they got on with the first things they started off with mostly Bibles, moved on to a prayer book known as a Psalter, moved on from there, but there was some political and civil strife in Mainz, and some of the workers from their works moved elsewhere. The people moved around a lot of the time when things got a bit heavy where they were living, and started to set up their own printing operations up and down the Rhine, and eventually moving to Italy, up to the western frontiers of Europe in Paris and Rotterdam, eventually reached England in 1474 with William Caxton. So it spread quite quickly, and going back to the notion of the trade guilds that I talked about, which most craft skills at the time were very much tied up within their particular guild. But because printing was a new art, although Fust and Schoeffer did try and keep it secret, for their own benefit, they couldn't keep it secret forever. And as soon as it broke out, people were free. As soon as subject to having the skills and the wherewithal to set themselves up, could set themselves up as printing. So as a printer, so it did spread around Europe in a way that lots of other skills, like glassmaking, for example, was very concentrated in Venice, because the glassmakers guild in Venice was so protective and secretive that if someone were to try and leave the city with their trade secrets, in some cases they would track them down and actually kill them. So, but printing didn't have that protection, so it spread. It's a bit like it's very much really like the spread of the internet. There are no physical borders that could hold the internet, and so it spread really fast and hasn't been subject to the usual national laws and so on that other industries have been subject to through
through normal recent history. So over the next 50, 100 years, what was printed moved from being mostly religious material much more into the mainstream. In concert with this, more and more people began to learn to read because books became affordable and accessible. So they moved from being, as I say, mostly in the realm of religion. They moved into the academic subjects for the market, the university markets that were springing up. But then they moved into these more everyday markets. And one of the genres that I find most fascinating was these books of secrets that emerged about 100 years after the beginning of printing. Basically, these books took all those secrets of practical knowledge that had been existing within these little pockets of the various guilds around Europe and started writing them down and sharing them. And this was really revolutionary because it broke open all these little pockets of knowledge that had existed in these secret societies for hundreds and hundreds of years, and brought them all out into the open and into a giant melting pot of knowledge that then started to cross-fertilise. And you can imagine a big cauldron as you put more and more ingredients in, and it starts fizzing up and bubbling up. And this was really the explosion of learning and knowledge that we call the Renaissance, and began this whole process, the whole process of realising that the secrets of the universe aren't really secrets at all. They're just, they're there waiting to be revealed, and taking us neatly into the next couple of centuries and the scientific revolution and all the amazing discoveries that went on then. Knowledge was a very fragile thing, and a lot of the activity of the monks in the scriptorium copying manuscripts was all about preserving the knowledge that they had, because in previous periods the Europeans knew that knowledge could be lost. It was lost after the Romans left, and it was the big fires in the great Baghdad library lost a huge amount of knowledge. And what the printing press allowed was for knowledge to become secure, because once you had hundreds or thousands of copies of something, it was safe. And then so that the great minds of the day could apply themselves to progressing that knowledge, not just protecting it. So this is a really important aspect of what the printing press allowed the scholars and thinkers and actually everyday people of the day to do, was to take for granted what was there and move on from it. And that's really the introduction of the notion of progress in society, which up until that time had been really quite cyclical. And there wasn't sort of this linear notion that we must be moving on forward and upwards. It was, we go around, there's life and death, the seasons. But after this process of printing, each step forward could be consolidated and taken, and then you could take another step forward, knowing that with sufficient copies of material printed and shared around and scrutinised by various different heads, that was secure, so you could hold that place and move forward, and hold that place and move forward. And this was a real change, both in scholarship, and also in worldview of the people of the time, which is partly why I'm so interested in it in terms of a history of seeing and what the impact it had on how people saw their world. They rather than seeing it as an eternal mystery, the printing press allowed people to start seeing the world as a puzzle to be solved and bit piece by piece revealed. And the other thing that it did, which is why it's the year that I've chosen in the history of seeing, is that it changed the method of transmission of knowledge and information from the spoken to the written, or rather printed word. And in so doing, it changed the primary mode of receiving knowledge and information from the ear to the eye. And it's really the beginning of a truly visual culture for the Western world.
That's beautifully summarised. Could I ask you my final question then, which is the one that comes around every episode as well? We give you a chance to dabble in a bit of material history. If you could bring a memento back of your time strolling around Mainz and Frankfurt and poking your head into the press room at Gutenberg's. Is there anything you would like? What would you like to have?
Well, I mean, it would be really nice to have a Gutenberg Bible, but I think that's probably a bit greedy since they are priceless objects. I would be quite happy with just a little handful of types.
Oh, well, that's very modest of you. We do encourage greed at this section, so we could give you a Gutenberg Bible, but then the types themselves, I suppose, take you right back to that moment of kind of, individual craftsmanship, which is at the centre of the story, and a wonderful moment in itself. Congratulations on the book, Susan Denham Wade. It's been a real treat to talk to you today. Thank you very much for coming on Travels Through Time.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Susan Denham Wade just the other day about a story she tells in much greater detail in her new book, A History of Seeing in 11 Inventions. It's available from the History Press right now, and I urge you to go and check it out. I mentioned the other day that our friend Jordan Lloyd has been working on a great new project called Unseen Histories. Well, today that website is launching with an exclusive extract from Susan's book. So if you enjoyed today's episode and would like to read much more, head over to unseenhistories.com to see the whole beautiful package. Violet's going to be back on Tuesday with that fabulous author Michael Pye, who's going to be taking her on a tour of a city that was, in the 16th century, at the very centre of the world. Can you guess which city it is? I'll leave you with that thought, because that's all from me today. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.